lawmakers, including some in both parties, criticizing the DOJ for the next step, also late in its compliance with the Epstein transparency law. The DOJ sent a 6-page letter to Congress. This is required by that law, and it discusses the very controversial redactions and purports to list all the government officials and politically exposed person that are named in the files. That's one of the law's requirements. But the list doesn't really pass muster. With very little context, it includes some names that are exposed, including President Trump, Steve Bannon, Les Wexner, a billionaire tied to Epstein, and then others like Janis Joplin and Marilyn Monroe, which is hard to understand because it's not understandable. Those individuals, long deceased, do not fit in the congressional definition. So it raises the question, one, why are they on this list? And two, did the DOJ even proofread and correct this list? Does it care about even seeming like it's accurate and on the level? Heat continues on Attorney General Bondi. Even some conservative commentators have suggested that her time is up, that she should resign after a bonkers and combative congressional hearing where she really made it a point not to answer questions despite being under oath and that being part of the job of showing up for an oversight hearing. Lawmakers continuing to call her out.
This is a massive cover-up being led by the White House and the DOJ.
Do you still have confidence in Pam Bondi as Attorney General?
I don't think Pam Bondi has confidence in Pam Bondi.
The actual files that have been out in the public or that we've seen, they're overly redacted.
Ultimately, it's her who is responsible for the document production.
The last voice you heard is a Republican member of Congress discussing the obvious. Despite all of the lower standards or rank incompetence that has been on display in the administration recently, the Attorney General is responsible for this. And the letter's not accurate. And they already broke the law by being this late. And Bondi's been caught making several misstatements or lies about the Epstein files. So in a healthy, normal democracy, you would have accountability for that. The person might resign, trying to show the president they get it, or they might be removed by the president. Or if the malfeasance is proven, Congress might ultimately consider impeaching Bondi out of her role, something that former Trump lawyer Ty Cobb talked to us about, making some headlines. That was just last week. As for what we're learning in the files, well, there was one Trump confidant, Tom Barrack, who is the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and has been a special envoy, who had contact with Epstein for years. Commerce Secretary Lutnick only admitted that he visited Epstein's island after the new files showed that he'd been lying about that in public. Other powerful individuals outside of the Trump cabinet and administration have faced far more accountability than people working for Trump. There was a story we reported on when it first broke that Casey Wasserman, who's really a powerhouse figure behind the scenes in L.A., not maybe a name that everybody knows, but you know all his clients. He's one of these super agents. And so many of his clients have basically protested his link to Maxwell in the files, saying they would or will leave if he doesn't do something, that he's actually selling his entire agency, his entire empire, because he doesn't have clients who'll stand by him. Or Obama vet and prominent business people ousted. International figures have been held to account. We have continued to see this contrast between accountability in independent institutions and abroad, while President Trump, who once claimed he wanted to get to the bottom of these files, won't even remove a single employee of their role, despite really audacious links to Epstein.
Well, I mean, I think the difference in democratic accountability is a big part of it. This government has worked to insulate itself from many of the mechanisms of accountability. There's also just different interests at play. I don't think that the government of England or of France, where a diplomat is in trouble over his Epstein ties, the governments themselves are not fundamentally invested in minimizing Epstein and his crimes the way that this government is, because the head of this government is one of the people that you would think would be held accountable if you start going down that road, right? I mean, it's the head of the United States, members of his cabinet, people who were intimately involved in his campaign. This is his circle. And so obviously he has a not just vested interest, but really an existential interest in avoiding accountability for Epstein relationships.
Yeah. And Andrew, I mentioned the letter. There were many people skeptical of this DOJ under Bondi who thought, would you ever get any documents? Would you ever get anything that wasn't totally blacked out? And so in my job as a journalist, I think it's important that we reflect that there was a lot of new material released. And some of it made Trump figures look bad for the reasons we just discussed. Some of them made Steve Bannon and others look bad. We don't know, perhaps, whether other really hot material around the president, et cetera, was still not given up. But I'm wondering how you view that level of compliance. The DOJ apparently did not want to just completely break the law, obviously. And now they're partial compliance with the letter, which matters because that's where they document under the law what they gave over. But names like Marilyn Monroe and Joplin kind of, at a minimum, make a joke of it. How do we look at this with nuance, with balance for what's happening, Andrew?
Sure. Well, let's start with the fact that there are documents that were released, but it's hard to say that you should give credit to the Department of Justice for partially complying with the law. Remember, they weren't doing any of this until Congress passed a law that said you have to. And so I just can't stomach the idea that I'm going to be saying, oh, well, Attorney General deserves credit for complying in part with the law. That's her job.
I feel you.
That is what the Department of Justice is supposed to do. But let's now focus on the in part. In the letter that was just released to Congress, they actually say that they are withholding documents. They don't say how many, but it could be in the millions, because we know that there's a huge tranche they turned over, but there's a huge tranche they're keeping. And they say they're withholding it based on privileges. They say it's attorney-client. They say it's work product. It's deliberative process. That means all of the documents that we'd be very interested in, which is government reports, government assessments, all of that could be withheld under those claimed privileges. Why is that a problem? It's a problem because the law itself does not permit that. The law actually says these are the grounds you can assert, and these are the grounds you cannot assert. And so the department is not in compliance with the law. So that's another reason that I think it's fair to say about the department that they are completely flouting their legal responsibilities. And if you think there's damning material in what's been released, you do have to ask yourself, what's in the remaining parts?